Welcome to another episode of Cadence Fishing TV, and I've come back today to the beautiful River Severn at Shrewsbury. We had the RiverFest Final at the weekend. I was lucky enough to draw two fantastic pegs, and this is peg 48, the peg I drew on the second day of RiverFest. It's a beautiful peg, and my plan today is to fish it in the same way that I did in RiverFest, explain about the rigs, how I fed it, and what my strategy was over the weekend. So my tactics for both days of RiverFest, in the end, after a lot of deliberation, was that I was going to ball it with ground bait at the start, particularly if I drew in the quarry section, which is this section here. On the first day on peg 90, I put in 6 balls of ground bait with just a bit of hemp in, hardly any feed. And we'll talk about that peg later, but what I wanted that day was to try and just get an immediate response from some fish, hopefully some dace, start to get some fish going and then take it from there, just depending on how it was fishing. On the Sunday, because I'd had a good day on the Saturday and I'd drawn another great peg, I decided to be bold and ball it in again with 6 balls of ground bait, this time just neat ground bait and with a bit more loose feed in terms of a lot of hemp and casters. So I think what I'll do is I'll do a bait section and explain about the ground bait and the different baits used, but I'm now going to ball it in exactly like I did on the Sunday match. So I've made up 6 balls of ground bait and I'm going to ball them in at 14 metres. Obviously, like on all matches, I spent a lot of time plumbing up the swim, and it was quite obvious that there wasn't a great deal of depth between, say, 8 metres right out to the middle of the river. But what was my key factor in selecting that 14.5 metre length was the fact that the flow, and you can see it very clearly today by these leaves, is really defined sort of this side of the middle of the river, and it's around about 14 to 16 metres. So it's within pole range, and I wanted to exploit that. So what I did was I balled it at 14 metres rather, and then I was prepared to loose feed around that general area to try and find out where the best place to fish was. And that's exactly what happened on the day. Interestingly, on the day, I balled it in, and I didn't have a bite for over 30 minutes. So I was starting to panic a bit, but I kept loose feeding and eventually I started to catch some nice roach. So it'd be interesting to see what happens today. So always when I ball it in on a river, I'll use my pole rest so that I can get the pole in position, and obviously spend a lot of time thinking about where I'm going to put the balls. I want to throw them to the right spot so that I can understand where they settle and break down, and obviously I want to be efficient in how I can run my rig over the top. So I don't want to put the balls too high up the peg where it's going to be difficult to control my float over the top, and conversely I don't want to put it too far down the peg. So you can see that I've set my pole up so that it's slightly downstream on the line that I'm going to start on, and I'm going to throw those balls about a metre downstream of where I'm sitting. And I want to be as accurate as I can, but also I'm not too worried if the balls land in a little bit of a line. As long as I've got the right distance, I'm effectively creating a band of ground bait that I can run my float over, so perhaps within a metre area of my target. So that was that. And then the next thing I did was just started loose feeding quite a lot of hemp and a few maggots. So I think we'll talk about that next. So Shrewsbury is a fantastic match venue with a wonderful heritage, and I used to fish opens on here a lot in the past, but probably not in the last 10 years. So to be honest, I was a bit unsure about how I was going to approach the RiverFest Final. A great fact was that I fished the the festival, which was around about a week before, and that was a 3-day festival, and it proved to be absolutely essential because I was lucky enough to do quite well. I actually came third overall in the festival, and obviously fishing 3 days in match conditions really helped me to formulate the plan. Obviously, if conditions had changed, then I'd have had to change my tactics, but as it was, the conditions on the final weekend were exactly the same as the festival. Basically, the river, like today, is very low and very clear. So it's not actually perfect really for conditions when you're fishing on the Severn here around Shrewsbury this time of year. You normally want a bit more water, perhaps at least a foot or 2 foot of water. Anyway, in conclusion, I learnt during the festival that the pole was by far the best approach. I had 2 great days on the pole in the festival, catching double figures of roach and dace, and 1 day catching on a light bollow, and that was up on the county ground. So, like I mentioned at the start, in my mind I was sure if I drew on the quarry, my main attack was going to be the pole. I obviously had other rods set up, wagglers and sticks, just in case I needed to, but my mindset was to really exploit the pole. Anyway, as always, whenever I ball it in, I always want to get straight in, because a lot of the time when you ball it in, you're looking for an instant response. So it's actually the disturbance of throwing the ground bait in that can attract the fish. So what my sort of thinking is, I want to get straight in on that pole line, and I'm not worried about anything else. I'm not feeding any other lines. I just want to concentrate on that line and hopefully start my match off by picking some fish up really quickly. And like I say, on the day I didn't have a bite for a good 30 minutes, and I was starting to think I might have made a big mistake. So I was starting to think about perhaps feeding a waggler line a bit further out and trying that, but I'm glad I didn't, because I started to catch some nice roach and dace, and that pretty much just formed the basis of the day, just fishing 1 line for roach and dace. And I did feed a chock worm line as well down the peg, and I'm going to try that today. It didn't work on the final, and that was a real shame, because during the festival I caught some lovely perch on that line, and you know, with just a couple of perch, I would have perhaps ended up winning it, but never mind. One good thing about having another line like that chock worm line is it means I could rest my main roach line, and that proved to be essential, because I found that I'd catch 2 or 3 nice roach, and then it would go quiet, and by resting it for 5 or 10 minutes I'd go back in again, and the fish had obviously gained confidence and I'd catch a couple more fish. Well, one thing I did do in the festival as well as RiverFest Final was, at the start of the match, loose feed hemp. And you might be able to see that I'm loose feeding the hemp on the same line, and maybe just a fraction further than where I put the ground bait, and slightly downstream. And my thinking with the hemp is, it's a great attractor. The noise of the hemp falling through the water, I think, will help to attract fish into the area that I'm obviously wanting to catch them. And by regularly feeding hemp, certainly at the start of the match, I think it's a big advantage. And another thing that I found out during the festival was that if I was targeting dace, if I thought there was more dace than roach, feeding hemp was fantastic, particularly on a hard day. I think it perhaps is that fact that you're attracting the fish, but maybe not really feeding them that much. And conversely, if I was catching roach, I started to reduce the amount of hemp and increase the maggots, because they're big roach, and in my experience, when you start catching big roach, you want to be feeding a good amount of maggots. So I'll keep loose feeding hemp, and then what I'll also start doing is introducing a few maggots. So perhaps just 5 to 10 every cast, in the same position as the hemp, about a metre below where I fed the ground bait. As you can see, the river's, it's hardly moving, and I don't want to be feeding. I want to make sure that I feed in the perfect position to be able to present my float and hopefully catch the fish. The difference today on Sunday is there's a lot of leaves here, and I've got quite a light rig on at the moment, and I'm struggling a bit to get it through the leaves. So I think I'll put a slightly heavier bolt rig on now and just try that. But like I mentioned, you know, it would be easier to fish closer in terms of not catching the leaves, but I want to be fishing past that crease where the flow starts, because I think that's where the fish, or the better fish, I want to feed. When I've been fishing here before on matches, I found if I fish closer, I could catch fish quicker, but they were a lot smaller. So I pretty much discounted them. I wanted to fish, have one main line and trying to trap the quality fish. So hopefully this bolt rig, whilst I've got all these leaves coming through my swim, will help me sort of bomb the bait down a bit. I'll explain about the different rigs that I used in a bit more detail, but basically I had two rigs that I was catching on this main line. One was a bulked one like this, which was a gram, and the other one was a lighter 0.6 or gram with a strung out style rig pattern. And actually that was by far the best rig, but it's hard to fish when there's so many leaves, so we'll just give this a go. So I know at the moment I'm running over the ground bait. Well, hey, there was a bite anyway, so that's proved to help. And we'll see what it is. I think it might be a dace. Oh no, it's a roach. So I just hold him up for you, and that's actually pretty typical of the stamp of roach I was catching. I don't know what he is, he's perhaps 5 ounces, but the roach really weigh here. And I caught fish from perhaps 3 ounces up to a pound on the day. They're absolutely beautiful roach. So I'm having to sort of pick my spot today to try and lower my bait in without catching a leaf. But that's just above where I reckon my ground bait is. And I'm just lowering the float down into position. There's another fish. Maybe a bit bigger roach this time. You'll notice I'm taking my time because I actually fish quite fine, and I think that was another key factor we'll talk about when we talk about the rigs. But in my mind, because they're such a quality size, I mean, look at that one, you can quite quickly build a weight up. So the last thing I want to do is bully him and risk losing one. And another thing I did was, even with the dace, I was netting nearly everything, because I just wanted to make sure that I was maximising all the fish I was hooking by landing them. So it's interesting really, because this method, sometimes it doesn't feel like you're catching very quickly. And you know, particularly when you've got anglers around you, perhaps fishing closer in with a whip, they're probably catching a lot quicker. But I don't think they're catching the same quality of fish. So I was quite prepared to just take my time and try and build the swim up and target the bigger fish. And actually both days in my mind, my target was £10. And I was lucky enough both days to really exceed that. I had two 18-pound weights. The first day on peg 90, I caught 79 dace and one roach for £18.6. So they were a really great stamp fish those days. And it surprised me really. I thought I'd got around about £12, so the average size of the dace was absolutely phenomenal. And then on this peg, on the Sunday, I caught 30 nice roach, up to £1, and 12 dace. So it wasn't a frantic day catching loads of fish, but that day I managed to build up a weight of £18.15, and that got me really close to winning the RiverFest Final. I actually ended up second overall to Lee Wright, and Lee had a fantastic couple of days and he beat me by, I think it was 14 ounces in the end, so it was a really close run thing in the end. But I was just really pleased with how both matches went. It was proved to be a good start. I've had 3 nice roach in, 4 put-ins, and a much better start than I actually had on the day. Just shows what a prolific venue Shrewsbury is, and the quality of the roach just absolutely phenomenal. So there we go, there's the dace, the first one of the day, and it's a good stamp fish, probably about 3 ounces. Like I mentioned, on the first day up on peg 90, that was really a small dace. I was catching dace that must have been 6 or 8 ounces. They were absolutely massive, and even though I wasn't catching loads, again I was able to build up a really great weight. So I think I'll have try and catch one more fish on this line, and then I'm going to talk about the chop worm line and feed that. Because even though I didn't catch on it on the final, it was a great tactic on the festival, and like I mentioned, it formed a big part of my plan because it was giving me the chance of hopefully catching a decent bonus fish, but also really importantly it was letting me rest my main line. Presentation wise with the float, you can see that I'm basically letting the float go through at the speed of the current. The river's hardly moving, and what I was doing was every so often I was just holding back. Now that's a small fish, a really small dace, but that's what I found to be the best sort of presentation, was to pick up the flow as much as possible, hold it back and lift the bait off the bottom and constantly work the bait. And the lighter style rig really helped, because I don't think you can beat that form of presentation, and that was by far my best rig over the 2 days. Right, let's try and catch a better fish and then we'll talk about the chop worm line. So I've decided now, I've had a couple of days and that small day, so I'm going to cut out the hemp and I'm just going to feed maggots, and I'm going to be a bit braver and feed a good pouch full of maggots. There's obviously fish there and fish feeding, and I want to make sure I'm getting some maggots down to the roach that perhaps are feeding underneath those smaller days. There we go. I think that's a better roach. These are the ones. Wonderful. I don't really want to stop catching these, but I'm going to give that main line a rest now. But look at that. That's got to be 8 or 10 ounces. I really think the roach are heavier than you think. Like I said, they feel so heavy. What an absolutely pristine fish that is. So the chop worm line. I think everybody probably approaches how they fish and use different baits and exploit the swim differently. But in my mind, when I'm river fishing, I want to have a chop worm line, a positive bonus line, and in my mind I want to keep it well away from my other line, my other main line. So if I'm catching roach and dace, I want to keep the other line well away from it. So what I tend to do is I'll actually, rather than fishing perhaps close into the bank with a chop worm line at sort of 4 meters or out 8-10 meters towards my main line, I actually like to fish it way downstream. And a lot of the time I'll fish my chop worm line 14 meters or 16 meters down the peg. So I'm obviously not fishing 16 meters out, I'm fishing 6 meters of pole, and I'm exploiting a completely separate area of my swim. And obviously where I do fish that line is going to be dictated to by the contours of the river. So on a shallow peg, like when I drew peg 90, I had to put that line further out to get some more depth. On this peg you've got a nice depth, quite close in. It's probably 5-6 foot, just 4 meters out from the bank. So I picked myself a mark and it was that boat, and I suppose I was fishing about 8 meters out from the bank. And again, maybe different to how other people approach chop worm on rivers. I never feed it until I go on it with worms, but what I might do is loose feed casters or maggots in that general area. And my thinking there is, obviously I want to prime the line so that I can drop on it, rest my main line and hopefully catch a fish. So what I often do at the start of the match is cup in an amount of casters, like a good handful of casters, and put it in a general area. Not too bothered about fishing it too accurately, because what I want to do is attract fish onto that line. I think sometimes you can attract smaller fish by feeding maggots and casters that in turn will attract the bigger fish like the perch. Because obviously perch are predators and they'll be attracted by those small fish feeding. So that's my sort of mentality. So I want to just generate an area to attract some fish feeding, and then like in this situation now, when I want to go on that chop worm line, I'm going to actually chop some worms up and go straight on it, because I think it's almost like if I've attracted the fish and the perch, bonus fish like chub, into that general area, I then want them to sort of focus on one spot, and I think there's no better attractor than chop worm to do that. And certainly to start with, I won't go mad. I'll perhaps just chop up 10 or 15 worms into a really fine mush like that. And it's not very pretty, but I'll show you. So there's so much juices and attractants there from the worms. There's some small bits of worms that the fish will obviously feed on. And you'll notice that I've left a bit of the peat in from the worms, or the medium, whatever that is that comes with the worms, like a dark soil. And that just really just binds it enough to make a loose kind of ball. And when I'm not fishing on a peg with much flow like this, I prefer to cup the chop worm in rather than bait dropper it. I don't think it harms to bait dropper it the first time, but if I've got perch and big fish feeding, I don't want to spook them with a bait dropper. And I'm pretty confident that that ball of, or that loose ball of chop worm is going to get down perhaps to mid-water, break up, and then create a beautiful, attractive cloud to bring the fish into. So anyway, let's try it now. Like I said, I want to go straight on that to maximise perhaps just catching one bonus fish that's come in on that initial feed. You often find that some days you only catch 1 or 2 fish on the initial feed and you don't catch any more. But on other days, when you've obviously got a good peg for perch and bonus fish, you can keep topping up and keep the fish coming all day. On the festival, on the first day, I drew peg 55, and it was actually a hard day. It was bright sunshine. Obviously the river was really low and clear, and I got into a good rhythm of catching some nice roach and dace on the long pole. And this bonus line really paid off because I caught 3 big perch. I mean, they were between 2 and 3 pound. They were absolute beauties, and that obviously really boosted my weight, and I actually won my section, which was a great start to the festival. So you can see there, I'm going straight over the top of where I cupped the chop worm. I'm using a 2 gram float with a bulk, and I've just gone in with half a worm and a caster. So let's see if, and like on the RiverFest Final, if I can actually catch something on this line. It'd be typical if I caught a big perch or chub now after failing at the weekend. Whenever I'm fishing with chop worm and I'm targeting perch, I want to be really active with how I present the bait. So I'll let that settle now, the worm's on the bottom, and I want to try and attract a perch, so I'll really move the float around. It's quite amazing how you can sort of almost jig the worm and attract a perch to take it on a hard day. That's exactly what happened on peg 55 on the festival. All the perch I caught them by actually really moving the worm, sometimes like that, by about 1 foot or 2 foot one way, let it settle. So I've lifted it off the bottom and it's probably just dropping back onto the bottom now, and then move it again. So you're really trying to entice the perch into taking it. But it's not a method that I think works so well for chub and bigger bonus fish, apart from perch. So what I will do as well is every so often I'll just let the bait settle. I'm fishing about 6 inches over depth, and I'll just leave it there and hold the bait and the float as still as possible. I think that's critical for eels. A lot of the time with eels you need the bait to be really nailed on the bottom. So I suppose it just depends on what fish you're sort of catching to how you actually present the bait. But you'll notice that I'm still feeding my main roach and dace line, and I've decided to cut out the hemp completely and I'm just feeding maggots. So hopefully the roach out there will be feeding away and we'll get back into catching some good stamp roach as well. So we've not had a response yet, so I'm going to give it one more go, but at least I've established an area that I can keep dropping on, hopefully get a bonus fish. Well, I went back on the main line and had 2 days in 2 casts, so I thought I'd try the style rig. The leaves are perhaps not as bad as they were, and I'm able to present it with that rig now. And this rig really made a difference for me on both the festival and on the RiverFest Final. I found when the fishing was hard, particularly when I was targeting the roach, this rig was absolutely brilliant. It's got to be the best form of presentation. Obviously, if I was catching a good amount of days quickly, I'd want to be using a more positive rig, but this lighter rig really worked well for me. I think that is another days. Oh no, it's a roach. But I really think this was a key factor in my success in both the festival and the RiverFest Final. Another interesting thing that I learnt was that for me, single maggot was by far the best bait. I was fishing fine lines and fine hooks, and single maggot was the better bait. And what was interesting, quite fascinating really, was just by changing the colour of the hook bait, I could get a bite. So I think probably the best bait was bronze maggot, single bronze maggot, but I caught some on red, and I did really well on some fluoro maggots. It just amazes me how that can happen. How can a fish suddenly decide to take the bait when you perhaps had 2 or 3 runs with one bait, go in with another and get a bite? But anyway, it worked, so I kept doing it. And that was a fish on the drop and I bumped it. But another bait that perhaps people don't tend to associate when they're fishing on big rivers like the Severn was pinky. And I caught quite a lot of fish on single fluoro pinky and double fluoro pinky. I also got some casters with me, and obviously I put some casters in the ground bait, and there's no real finer bait for catching big roach than caster, but I personally didn't find it to work very well. I tried it in the festival. I could catch the odd fish, but nothing like as many as I was catching on maggots. So I didn't really feed casters apart from in the initial feed on my main line. I did feed casters on the chop worm line, and I was prepared to give the caster a go on it with a lighter rig, because you never know, you can catch some big roach sometimes closer in on caster, but it didn't work for me. So I decided on the RiverFest Final to narrow everything down and really focus on fishing maggot on the pole. Another interesting pattern, if you like, that kind of emerged on both days was that I really caught, I don't know, 90% of my fish right on top of where I was feeding. I think it's probably just due to the fact that the river is so sluggish with it being so low. And actually, that was where I definitely caught my big fish, the big roach. I caught them right on top of the feed. And I did find, like that, in that case there, I ran further down my peg and I got a smaller dace. So I definitely wanted to be concentrating in that sort of 2 metre area where I'm loose feeding. With this style rig, you must get the most fantastic presentation. So you can hold the float back like I did then as the styles settle. You just must get the most natural fall of the bait through the water. And I mean, today this is fishing a lot better than it did on the actual final. Probably because I'm the only person on the bank, but definitely for the bigger roach, that lovely slow fall of the bait really helped. And I actually caught very few fish hard on the bottom. Obviously during the match you keep changing the depth by shallowing up a bit, going deeper. And funnily enough, on the Sunday on this peg, if I went over depth, I just caught leaves. So very quickly I decided I wasn't going to keep doing that. I was sort of fishing dead depth or up to a foot off the bottom, and that was definitely the best policy on the day. one thing that you might notice is I sometimes lower the style rig in, feed, and then lift it back up again. So I'm putting my hook bait right in amongst the loose feed. And sometimes I'd find that it was just starting to settle like this, just starting to settle, and wow, I got a fantastic bite, and it was nearly always a good roach. Well, there we go, that's another quality roach on the style rig, and proved to be exactly what I said. I think the maggot was probably just sort of getting down into the bottom 2 foot of water, and that roach nailed it. Absolutely wonderful fishing. Well, I've just had 2 lovely roach on the star rig. Ah, there we go. I think that was another one. Today I'm catching really well at 14 metres. And one thing that was of note during the festival and over the RiverFest weekend was the fact that sometimes I had to go further out. And actually that's a nice dace. So both days of RiverFest, I was catching at 14 metres. Looks like that one's been had by a pike at some point. But by the end of the match, I was fishing 16 metres to keep in touch with the fish. And you might notice when I'm feeding, I'm intentionally spreading my bait between 14 metres and 16 metres. And my thinking there is, I'm hopefully picking the fish off from this side of the shoal to minimise the disturbance of obviously hooking a fish and dragging it through the shoal. But definitely at times during the match, the fish will back off. And that's where going to 16 metres really helped me keep in touch with the fish. So I think after this cast, I'll try it and just see. There might be a better roach just hanging a bit further out. Today, the conditions are absolutely perfect. There's not a breath of wind, and it's actually like this on Sunday. And that was in total contrast to Saturday, where it was a really windy, gusty day. And up on peg 90, I got really battered by the wind. It was in my face and downstream. And to be honest, I think if I had fished another method like a waggler and a bollo, I'd have really struggled to present the bait and even feed the bait. So for me, fishing the pole on the Saturday up on peg 90 made a massive difference. Obviously with a pole, when you're fishing long 14 and 16 metres, you can really present the float way better than with a rod and line. And also you can fish with much lighter rigs. And I think that really made a big difference on the day. I mean, it's never nice fishing at 16 metres if you can help it, but it's definitely a big advantage, particularly when the river's low and clear like this. And I'm using our Cadence CP2000 pole, which is by far and away the best pole I've ever used at long lengths like this. It's still really manageable, it's really nice and stiff and responsive. And I've got to be honest, it's given another dimension to my fishing really, because I used to hate fishing at 16 metres, and now I kind of enjoy it. And it's definitely, I think, really helped improve my catches on hard days. Just on cue, I think that's a roach. So in a match situation, I'd probably try fishing a bit further out at 16 metres, pick off a couple of fish and then come back short, because I don't want to push the fish any further away if I can help it. Well, it's not a roach, it's a big dace. But that's the stamp of dace that I was catching up on peg 90. And they're absolute clonkers. And like those roach, you soon start to build a weight of fish when you're picking off stamp dace like that. Okay, so I'm going to take a break from the fishing and just explain a bit about the rigs that I used over the RiverFest weekend. I basically set 2 silverfish rigs up, if you like, on a top 5 and one on the top 6. This is one of the rigs on the top 5, and it's a Graham Sensor's float. I can't actually remember what it's called, but it's a lovely float, and this is my sort of slightly more positive rig that I used with a bulk, and I actually used a slightly stronger hook length and elastic. On this rig I used a 6 elastic, and you can see I've got a bolt there, and I've got number 9 shot that I can bring into play, either to have spread out like that with 4 number 9s, or I can make a double bulk. And over the festival weekend, this was a great rig when I was catching dace, particularly on the deeper pegs. I drew peg 95, which is about 16 foot deep, and in the deeper water this rig worked well. But I set it up every match because it just gave me another presentation option. The best rig really I talked about today when I was fishing was this strung out style rig, and I had this set up on a top 5 as well. On this peg 84, that's got to be about 9 foot deep, but I also used this up on peg 90 where it's only about 5 foot deep. And you can see here my shotting pattern is I've got no styles sort of in the top 1/3 of the rig, and then I've got all the styles spread out. I've actually got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 number 13 styles. Then I'll go down to a size 11 and spread them out throughout the rest of the rig, dropping down to 3 number 9s at the bottom. And this style rig, like I mentioned, is just a fantastic rig for fishing on the drop when conditions are really hard. I can bulk those styles up, or I can keep them spread out like this, and I can adjust how I spread them out to affect how the bait falls through the water. And then the other rig that I set up was actually on a top 6, and I haven't had to use that today, and I didn't actually need to use it on Sunday. But obviously having a longer length of line will enable me to present the bait further down the peg. And on peg 90, which is a shallower peg, it was a much pacier peg, and this was my best rig. Obviously it was only 5 foot deep, and I found on peg 90 a bulk of 13 styles with styles spread out below was by far the best. I mentioned it was a really windy day and presentation was so difficult, but that rig worked really well. Interesting about the floats, I spent quite a bit of time trying to find the pattern I was most happy with. This is an old Shakespeare Super Team pole float in a Graham, and I used a Graham and a 0.6 of the version of this float. You can see it's got a carbon stem, it's got a good sort of, I don't know, inverted pear shape, and what's so critical is a really good hollow bristle, because the light here at Shrewsbury is notoriously bad. You get this dappled effect on the water with all the different reflections, and obviously with a wind ripple as well, it makes seeing your float really difficult. And I find that these floats, being slightly thicker in tip and hollow, show up really well, and I can really read the bites very effectively. So that was the sort of 3 silverfish rigs I set up. I also set up this chop worm rig that failed me over the RiverFest weekend, but was really successful on the festival. This might be interesting because a lot of people fish flat floats on rivers when they're fishing chop worm, and in my mind I will fish a flat float if the pace dictates it. But the fact that we've got hardly any pace on the line that I'm fishing this, a standard float to me is so much more versatile. That's a 2 gram Sensor's float. I forget what it's called. I think that might be called Avon, but it's got a decent thick tip, which is actually a fibre tip, and a carbon stem. And again, as I showed you with the worm, I can really lift and work the bait with that float, and I think matching the capacity of the float and the weight of the float to the flow really makes a difference. And I've shotted that with an Olivet, and again I've got number 9s and number 10s, so I can adjust the bulk to affect the presentation, and obviously I can change the hooks and hook lengths appropriately just to try and find the best presentation on the day. So to follow on, just a quick section on the actual rig components. For my silverfish rigs, I was using a .11 mainline, which I suppose might sound fine really for fishing on the Severn, but obviously the way this method evolved was to fish with some finesse. Lighter hook length, smaller hooks, so I wanted to balance the mainline to that. So I used a .11 mainline, and then on the two different rigs, on the 6 elastic, I was using a .97 hook length. My thinking there was obviously if I started to really catch well, you know, that would enable me to bully the fish a bit more and it'll be more robust. I wouldn't have to change the hook length so often. And with that with that line, I tended to match these Colmic hooks, which is B957, and I was using them in a size 20 or 18. And I found them to be the perfect sort of, I don't know, compromise really for fishing a bit more positively. Double maggot on the 18, single maggot on the 20. And that was a great hook on the Saturday when I was fishing up on peg 90, catching those big dace. Coming down here, due to the fact that the peg was so slow to start to catch, and also that I was catching such good quality roach, I was actually using .8 hook length. This is an old Super Team fluorocarbon, which I actually really love, but I think any 08 would have done the job. Just on that, a key thing that I found was I tended to prefer using a long hook length. So in my mind, when the fishing's really hard, I want to just maximise the presentation as much as I can. So I'll actually use a longer length, sometimes up to 2 foot for a hook length, with no shot on it or styles at all. And I think that just gives the absolute best presentation, and I think helps when you're trying to target those big crafty roach. The hooks I used on the lighter rigs and on the 083 was a 20 fine match, Drennan fine match. I did catch on Saturday on an 18 fine match, but here on peg 48, a 20 was by far the best with a single maggot. And the fine match for me is just a phenomenal hook. It is what it is. It's a traditional hook. It's a very lightweight, fine hook, but it just seems to be strong enough to play and land even bonus fish without any problem. You do find that you have to change them during the day because they get a bit distorted and bent out of shape, but for me, the fact that I maximise presentation is absolutely key. Okay, so let's have a look at the ground bait and baits that I've been using. The ground bait mix that I settled on was a 50-50 mix of this Bait Tech Fine Lake Dark and Bait Tech Extra. And for me, that gave a really lovely ground bait, a really attractive ground bait that's got some stickiness to enable me to bind the ground bait and ball it in. But I like the fact that it's, you know, perhaps a lighter mix than what I'd use typically on a river when the river's low and clear. And obviously I've used that as my initial bombardment mix and mixed it with a good amount of hemp and casters. And on the Saturday, I found by topping up with a ball perhaps every 20 minutes, that really did help, and the dace responded to it. But you couldn't do it too much, so I was very careful in my topping up. On the Sunday match on this peg, I never actually topped up because I didn't need to. I got the roach really feeding well on maggots, and I just wanted to, I didn't want to risk feeding ground bait and perhaps scare them off. It really was a really tricky day. So I suppose it's quite interesting that I just used a neat mix. A lot of the time when I'm fishing on big rivers like the Severn and the Wye, I'll add in a good percentage of molehill soil like that. Obviously that's great for adding a lot of weight to the mix and enabling you to perhaps dilute the ground bait a bit when you're feeding a lot of ground bait and topping up with a lot of ground bait. But I just felt with the river being so low and clear I wanted to use a really beautiful, attractive mix that's perhaps going to attract the roach. And I don't think that roach always want to be eating soil. And an interesting fact, on Saturday when I was catching those big dace, you could see that they were eating the ground bait. They were actually regurgitating it, so they obviously really did like that ground bait. Okay, so actual loose feed. I talked about how important hemp was. Obviously it's important for adding in my ground bait as an attractor and a feed, but also when loose feeding. And like I mentioned, I think it's just a great attractor. I think it's got to be something to do with the noise of it landing on the water and falling through the water. Definitely attracts fish. And it's an old trick that we used to use here at Shrewsbury. Certainly at the start of the match was really loose feed a lot of hemp, create a great disturbance and attraction. And that definitely worked for me in the festival and also on RiverFest. And like I mentioned, sometimes if I'm catching roach, I'll back off feeding that hemp and just feed maggots. It's just as the match evolves, how the peg responds, you can change your approach. Quite simple, I suppose, really, about maggots, but a good tip is that I like to buy my maggots in a big amount. So I buy a gallon of maggots probably every week from Lanes. I'm lucky enough to live near the tackle shop and they always have fantastic bait. But one thing I like to do is I like to keep, particularly in the winter, is keep the maggots perhaps for a week or two before I actually use them. And that sounds crazy because obviously you want to be typically using the freshest bait. But if you can see these maggots here, these are a couple of weeks old. They haven't really shrunk too much. They're still a beautiful big sized maggot, but they're definitely heavier. And obviously they have shrunk a bit from fresh maggots. These ones are less than a week old. And I think that's really key, particularly when the river's got a bit more pace, because I think they're heavier, that you can feel them. They're almost like bronze bullets. And not only do they catapult further, but I think they sink through the water better. So that's a good tip and one that I use a lot when I'm river fishing. But as you can see here, I've got some fresh maggots, bronze and red, for the hook. Because obviously I want the most attractive bait on my hook. And something that I've kind of kept to myself really for a long time is that I'll often buy a pint of mixed maggots, because for whatever reason on the day a different colour maggot can really work. During the festival I found when I was catching the dace, white maggots were outfished any other colour. For the roach, bronze was the best. And I think I mentioned it when I was fishing, sometimes you just change a hook bait to say a fluoro maggot like that and you suddenly get a decent fish. So it's worth bearing in mind. And then also, maybe a bit of a surprise to some folks, but I'll take the humble pinky with me, a fluoro pinky, and that can really have its day as well, where it'll outfish all different colours of maggots. Well, there's 6 or 7 pounds of beautiful roach and dace just taken in a couple of hours. What a wonderful venue. I hope you've enjoyed that. Let's get them back. Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed fishing the RiverFest competition this year, and obviously coming second was absolutely fantastic. Top congratulations to Lee Wright who won it and all the other framers. And I look forward to seeing you next year on the RiverFest competition. I think it's absolutely fantastic and I really love fishing all the different rivers in the qualifiers, and I just think it's brilliant. Also, thanks to Andy at Total Angling in Shrewsbury. I know that him and his team have put a lot of effort and time into improving the pegs and the venue, and I know they'll be on hand to give you any advice if you want to fish the river here or book into any of the matches. So thanks for watching.